Okay, Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. That's it.
I don't have volume. You might not have
I don't know
volume.
if other people will join. I mean, I specifically wrote down what you said to be sharp on
Nice,
time. So.
thank you. I appreciate that. David told me he was not going to make it at 8:30, which I can see why. Oh,
Jeff just joined. Okay, awesome.
Okay. So now we have a quorum. Shavua Tov, Jeff. I'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started. It's okay. It's actually not such a long daf, so it's complicated, but not so long, which is good for Eruvin, right? Okay, we'll give it a shot. So today's daf is daf Lamed Daled, and I'm gonna read from the bottom of Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis, even though I think that he did it on Friday, but it's the middle of a sugya. So incredibly complicated sugya. But basically, the idea here is that I won't say it's complicated, but I'll put it this way: there is an idea in our Mishnah that you have to be able to access your Eruv on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Let's say Shabbos, which is the issue here. You have to be able to access your Eruv on Shabbos in order for it to count as an Eruv. Remember, you don't actually have to eat your Eruv. So if you make an Eruv and you don't end up eating it, it doesn't mean that your Eruv didn't work. It just means you have to be able to have done it. And as we've seen in this last few dapim, it really depends on whether you could do it during Bein HaShmashot, right? What can you do during the time when Shabbos is started? So the Mishnah said that if you put it in a tree, right? Now, if you recall, there's a whole separate issue of putting it in a tree, which is that you're not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos, right? But that was an issue that was a little bit less concerning for us because presumably, at least for Rebbe, because the reason you can't use a tree on Shabbos is because it's a shvut, right? It's a Isur D'Rabbanan that you're going to come to pull something off the tree, let's say, and even though you're really not allowed to do that, the fact is that during Bein HaShmashot you could do that, and so because of that, the Eruv would count. But we had a second issue, which is how can you carry from? Oh, so David's here. David, I'm reviewing what you did on Friday. How can you carry from the tree into the place where you're standing? And so there, the Mishnah said that if it's above 10 tefachim in the tree, then that's considered to be its own Reshut HaYachid, and therefore it's not an Eruv. And if it's below 10 tefachim, then it is an Eruv. So then we had in the Brisa case that Rebbe said if it's in a basket, even above 10 tefachim, it's okay. So the question is why? So it says, and that's where I'm going to start. And I'm reading quickly because I know we did it yesterday and also because we don't have much time. But 6 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Shani Kalkala, a basket. I'm going to say a bucket. It's a little bit easier for me. A bucket is different. Again, the case here is, it's a complicated case. You have a tree. The tree has a trunk, which is probably 4 tefachim wide, so it's a Reshut HaYachid. Your bucket, I'm going to use, is hanging from a limb of the tree that's more than 4 amot from the center, and we discussed yesterday why you need that detail. It's more than 4 amot from the center, but it's on the tree, and it's above 10 tefachim. There, Rebbe says that the Eruv counts. Why does the Eruv count? If it's above 10 tefachim, it should be its own Reshut HaYachid, and you're standing on the ground, which is a Reshut HaRabim, and so you can't carry from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim. And says Rebbe, it's because, of course, if you were going to reach your hand into the bucket and take out the sandwich and take it out, you'd be going above 10 tefachim and you'd be carrying from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim, and that would be prohibited. But what you can do is, if you think about it, the bottom of the bucket is only 9 tefachim off the ground. And so instead of reaching in and taking it out, you could just bend over the bucket. I used a bucket so you have a handle, right? You could just turn it over so that the sandwich never goes above 10 tefachim. And if the sandwich never goes above 10 tefachim, then you can take it without going through a Reshut HaYachid. And that counts, which is a shocking thing to say, because you're basically saying that the bucket is a Reshut HaYachid and everything in it is, because it's on a tree that's above 10 tefachim. But if you transfer without going above 10 tefachim, you didn't carry from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim. But either way, that's what the Gemara says. So
just to note, at least yesterday, when I explained it, the explanation that I gave was slightly different. That even if you can say that the bottom of the bucket is 10 tefachim above, that it's because of the size of the bucket, it's big enough that you can tilt it so that you can get part of the bucket to be under 10 tefachim, and so as a result, you've essentially moved it from a Rishus HaYachid to a Carmelist, and now a Carmelist, you can then take it to a Rishus HaRabim. So I had it in 2 steps, but it depends on an issue that I guess that I wasn't covering and didn't cover yesterday, and I presume we're not going to cover,
We're
which
not
is
gonna
the
cover,
question
no,
of
but
whether or not the beginning of a hanging is a triggering of, whether things follow the beginning of the hanging or the actual location where it
Right.
is.
Correct. And it is very complicated. And again, I don't think we can go into it because, the reality is that if you did reach in, it would be counting from Rishut HaYachid, even if it was below 10. But either way. So that's what Rav Papa said, right? That's what Rav Yirmiyah said. Yativ Rav Papa. Now, Rav Papa was sitting, the Kakamar LaHashmaita, and he said this over. And Eitve Rav Abba, Rav Shva, Rav Papa. Rav Shva asked a question from the following, the Mishnah that we're going to have in a few days. The Mishnah says, very interesting case, right? So let's say a person has 2 days of Yom Tov, or Shabbos and Yom Tov, right? Like this year. Shabbos is Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah is on Sunday. So there's a machlokas later about whether you can make an Eruv for 2 days. But let's say you can't make an Eruv for 2 days. So you can't put an Eruv at the beginning and say this is good for 2 days. You have to have your Eruv at the place where you want to be at the beginning of every day of holiday. So the beginning of Shabbos, the beginning of Yom Tov. So what do? Says the Mishnah, Ketzad hu oseh, molicho b'rishon, you send your messenger to bring your Eruv, your sandwich, to stand in the spot that you want to be the place where you start your Yom Tov. Umachshich alav, and the person, assuming again this is Yom Tov, and lets it get dark, and then the person walks back to your house, or to wherever they want to go, they walk back to their house, the notlo, they take the Eruv with them, so that animals don't eat it or it doesn't get lost. Uba lo b'sheni, and then the next day, which let's say is going to be Erev Shabbos, right? So right before Shabbos, they go back out to that spot with the Eruv, umachshich alav, and then they let it get dark again. Now remember, it's Shabbos now, so you can't walk home with it, right? But you can eat it, right? So ochlo, ubalo, and the guy eats the Eruv, gets a good sandwich out of it, and then he goes home. Says the Gemara, okay, that's a Mishnah. We'll get there later in the week, in case you're curious. But the question is, Amai, why do you have to walk out to the spot in order to be there when Yom Tov starts or when Shabbos starts with your Eruv? Why can't you use this fiction that we just used? That, sure, the food is in the bucket. You can't take it from the bucket. But in theory, you could bend over the bucket and move it and shape it in a way to get it. So say the same thing here. Like if I wanted to walk there and stand in that spot, I could have done it during Ben Hashmashot. So therefore, even if I don't physically go there, right? Now Rashi is a little disturbed. Rashi says this is a weird case to say this from. Because basically what we're saying is, every time you make an Eruv, why do you have to put the Eruv in the place? You should just be close enough that you could get there in Ben Hashmashot and say, I can always walk wherever I want in Ben Hashmashot. So Rashi says that if you look through the Mishnayot, this is the most clear Mishnah where it talks about walking somewhere and putting your Eruv, right? Even, so the whole point of the Mishnah is about 2 days, and that's not the relevant issue. The point is that this is true about any time. Why do you have to place your Eruv where you want it to be when Yom Tov for Shabbos starts? Why can't you just be close enough that you can get there in Ben Hashmashot and mentally say, I could have gotten it there, and therefore it's as if it's there. So why don't you say that? Says Reb Zera, we don't say that. Because Gzera Mishum Yom Tov Shechal Yot Achar Shabbat. The concern is about a case where, let's say Yom Tov, like this year, Rosh Hashanah falls out on Sunday, right? Or at least our Rosh Hashanah. And Shabbos is before that. So then you have a problem, because obviously on Shabbos you can't carry. And so you can't leave your Eruv somewhere else and say, oh, I could have walked it there before Yom Tov, because the day before Yom Tov was Shabbos. And therefore you couldn't go anywhere on Shabbos, and therefore you have to physically have your Eruv in the place where you want it to be when Yom Tov starts. And since that's the case, therefore they made a gzera that every Yom Tov and every Shabbos, you should have your Eruv, you have to have your Eruv if you use, well, let me give you the F here. If you use a shliach, let me be very clear about that. If you're using a shliach, you have to have, we're on the top of Lamed Daled Amud Aleph. If you use a shliach, they have to physically put the food where you want it to be when Yom Tov for Shabbos starts in Ben Hashmashot for your Eruv to count. Rashi does point out that, remember, if you're making an Eruv for yourself, you don't need any food at all, just to be clear. You can actually go and stand in that spot and be kona your shvita. The only time you need food necessarily is if you're sending a shliach to do it for you, and you want the shliach to do it, or, which is our more circumstances, where you don't want to be there when Shabbos starts, right? So you put your food there before Shabbos, you go back home, and then something has to be there. But if you're physically standing there, which is the case in the Mishnah, right? You don't actually need the food. You could just be standing there yourself, and that would be okay for yourself. Anyways, that's a side point. Okay, so that's what we got up to on Friday. Sorry to go over it, but it's very important. Because eighth, now we have a problem from a Breita. The Breita says the following. Let's say it's Kaven Shvot B'Reshut Rabim. Okay, so you decide you want to spend your Shabbos, you want your place to be not in your house, but 1,500 amot away, which is somewhere in a, let's just say, in the market square somewhere. So that's where you want your Shabbos to be. So you don't want to leave your food on the ground because some animal's going to walk on it or someone will take it. So there's a hole in the side of the wall, right? And eruvo b'kota. You put your eruv in a little hole in the wall in the Reshut Rabim on Broadway. So if it's the mata me'asar tfachim, if this hole in the wall is below 10 tfachim, then eruv. Why? Because you can just grab it. Your shvita is in the Reshut Rabim. This is less than 10 tfachim in a Reshut Rabim, so it's part of the Reshut Rabim, and you're allowed to take it. But if the hole in the wall is the malam yasarat tfachim, ein eruvo eruv, then it doesn't count because above 10 tfachim in Reshut Rabim becomes, if it's big enough, a Reshut HaYachid, and you're standing in Reshut Rabim and you can't then take from Reshut HaYachid, and therefore you can't eat your eruv on Shabbos, and so it doesn't count. That's the first case. No one argues with that. The next case is complicated, so let's do it. It's kavein l'shvot b'rosh hashovan. Let's say you decide that you're going to watch the race, right? So you're in Baltimore, like we grew up, and you want your eruv to be at Pimlico, so you can go and watch on Shabbos. My childhood, and there's a pigeon container, a shovach, a bird cage. You decide your shvita is going to be on top of this cage. So this is how Rashi likes the pshat. And it's next to a wall in a Reshut Rabim. Oh, B'Rosh HaMigdal. Or you want to sit your Shabbos on top of a tower, which again, in my way this makes sense to me is you think of a lifeguard chair. That's how it makes sense to me. You'll see why in a second. Right? So there's a chair that's up, Rashi is very tall. Say 10 feet tall, whatever, 4 feet tall, 6 feet tall. 10 feet's better. 10 feet tall. And you decide you're going to spend Shabbos, or maybe you want to watch something, you want to sit there. Either way, that's where you want to do your shvita. So if now the food, just be clear, this is Rashi's case, if the food is in a Reshut Rabim next to your tower, okay, if that Reshut Rabim is the Mala Me'asarat Tfachim, then eruvo eruv. So now it's the opposite. Instead of saying that below 10 Tfachim is okay, above 10 Tfachim is not okay, here, if it's above 10 Tfachim, then it's okay. Why is it okay? Because above 10 Tfachim in a Reshut Rabim is considered to be a Reshut HaYachid, let's just say, or a Carmelin, and where you are sitting on top of your lifeguard tower is more than 4 Tfachim wide, so it's your own Reshut HaYachid. And so together, you can reach from one Reshut HaYachid into another Reshut HaYachid, even though you're passing it over a Reshut Rabim in between to get your food. But that prohibition, remember, if you don't stop along the way, is only an Isser Midrabanan. And therefore, you could do it, Ben Hashmashot, and it's okay to do it. Okay, that's the simplest way to understand it. So therefore, it's okay. But if it's the Mata Me'asarat Tfachim, if it's below 10 Tfachim, then it's a problem. Because if it's below 10 Tfachim, it's considered to be in the Reshut Rabim, and you can't reach from your Reshut HaYachid, maybe your Carmelid, into the Reshut Rabim and take the food. And so therefore, if your place of Shvita is on top of this lifeguard tower, you can't reach into Reshut Rabim, ein eruvo eruv. Then it doesn't work. Ask Mar why. Everybody who's gone to the beach understands, which is why I use the case. Why can't you just tip over the lifeguard chair? If you tip over the lifeguard chair, right, then the top of the chair is no longer above 10 tefachim. And so although your chair, I was in the beach last week, so I have an image in my head, right? When it's standing, it's 8 feet tall. But when you tip it over on the ground, it's 3 feet tall, right? Or 2 feet tall. It's below 10 tefachim. So why can't you just tip over the chair and then your makom shvita, which Tosa says you see from here, that if you tipped over the chair, your makom shvita would tip over with you, right? It's not the imaginary place where you started Shabbos, it's where you moved it to. But you tip it over and now you're below 10 tefachim. And if you're below 10 tefachim and your food is below 10 tefachim, then why can't you just take it on Shabbos? You're both in Reshut Rabim, basically. And so again, if you're relying on what we said yesterday, this sort of fiction, that whatever you could do during Ben Hashmashot is imagine, Why can't you just imagine turning over the chair and being on the side, right? So why can't you say that? What name a toto? Since you can bend over, you can knock over, or push over the chair or the migdal, as we call it. It should be okay. The obvious answer. It's where it's nailed into the ground, right? So it's not a movable chair, and so therefore, since it's not, or a tower, right? So since it's not movable, you could do that, but if it's nailed in, you can't say, imagine it's not nailed in and I move it over. Physically, you can't move it, and therefore, since physically you can't move it, that's why you can't have an eruv that's below 10 tefachim next to this chair. Rava says, no. I have another answer. It could even be a chair that's not attached to the ground, a migdal that's not attached to the ground. We're talking about a very tall migdal. Tall, again, migdal literally means a tower, right? But again, in my example, a tall lifeguard stand, meaning it's more than, let's say, more than 4 amot tall. It's 5 amot tall. And therefore, imamti le'porta, if you lean it over, it's going to go more than 4 amot away from where it started, right? So if it's more than 4 amot tall, let's say, then when you push it over, or let's say you might not be pushing it all the way over, but let's say it's 10 amot tall, you push it over halfway, you're going to be the top of the chair where kona your shvita is going to be more than 4 amot from where you started Shabbat. And therefore, so now Rashi says there's 2 problems then. The problem that Tosas likes more is that you then, remember the whole issue is that your shvita works, you get a 4 amma circumference from where you were. But if your food is no longer within that 4 amma circumference, it would be too far from where you started. That's the simpler problem. The bigger problem, the other problem, which is not so simple, is that maybe if you're more than 4 amot away, you can't carry the food that distance. But that's not as clear because, again, if you're carrying, you could maybe carry pachot me'arba amot, which we discussed last couple of days, that maybe you can, maybe you can't. Probably Rebbe said you can't, but that's a little more complicated. But certainly the shvita has moved, and that's a problem. And so therefore, we're talking about a very tall chair where if you bend it over, it'll be more than 4 amot from where you started. It says in Gemara, 1 second. Echidami, if you recall, that there was a very interesting halacha we had in the beginning of Shabbos, which is that if you were, everyone remembers this halacha, I remember at least, you're on the side of a building, and you're reading a scroll, the Megillah, and your Megillah rolls off the side of the building, remember. So the problem was that the bottom of the Megillah, now you're holding on to something, but it was down, it fell lower, and it was below 10 tefachim, and so it's down in the Rishut HaRabim, and you're in a separate place, you're in Rishut HaYachid. So we said there that as long as you're attached to it, meaning you haven't let go of it, you can reel it back up into your Rishut HaYachid. So ask the Gemara now, so why don't you do the same thing about your Eruv? Right? Why don't you, probably before Shabbos, you want to put your Eruv in this spot on the side of the wall. Unfortunately for you, the spot on the side of the wall is below 10 tefachim. Your lifeguard chair is too high, right? So you can't actually get it on Shabbos. But why don't you very cleverly tie a rope to your sandwich, put your sandwich in below 10 tefachim, and you'll just pull it up on Shabbos, which is the same as pulling up your Megillah, right? Now, remember, it's an Isur Midrabanan, except for Megillah, but remember, Isurei Durabanan are okay, because you can still make an Eruv, even if there's an Isur Midrabanan. So ask the Gemara, Ika kafta umatna, actually, kafta umatna means windows and holes, right? So, I'm sorry, matna means a rope, kafta means a window. So if you have, you're like MacGyver, you have the right material, why don't you just prepare it before Shabbos? Lightly b'kafta v'matna. We're obviously talking about a poor traveler who forgot his rope and his window at home. The let like kafta v'matna. So you find yourself without any rope, or maybe, now again, obviously in my situation, you don't need windows, but I'm assuming this was a closed tower, right? You would need a window. But the point is that you couldn't come up with another solution, and therefore, if you are above 10 tefachim, right, in this tower, and the food is below 10 tefachim, your Eruv doesn't count on Shabbos. And that's the case, and it works out according to everyone. Okay? We got it. Nice and simple. Continues the Mishnah, Natno Bebar. Now, Rashi's, I just want to say, even though we don't have time tonight, Rashi's a whole other pshat that doesn't like as much, which is also very interesting. But so if you want to later look in Rashi, he quotes it first. So it's the first pshat Rashi quotes, and then he quotes the one I just told you. And he says he likes that one more. And Tosas explains why. But Natno Babor, the Mishnah continued and said, if you put your Eruv in a pit, Afilo amot mea ama, even if it's 100 amot deep, even if it's a deep, deep pit, obviously you have to have a ladder to get down there. So you can't jump into a 100 amot pit, but it doesn't matter. It's fine. So this is one second. Where is this pit, right? Is it in a, if it's in your yard, in your Rishut HaYachid, then I don't get, of course, Pshita. Why would it be, if you can go down to the pit, right? Why would that be considered not your Rishut HaYachid? Of course your Eruv counts there. Rishut HaYachid oleh am l'rekia. We know, we've said hundreds of times, dozens of times, that a Rishut HaYachid extends straight up to the sky forever, right? Up to the sky. In the same way it goes up, it goes down, right? It's bi-directional. And so your property extends down as far as you dig, right? And so, of course, it's a Rishut HaYachid. Why would there be any problem putting your Eruv there? Ella must be the Kai Rishut Rabim. Or must be here that you're talking about a public space. And so the pit is dug in a Rishut Rabim, and you put your Eruv in this in a pit, in a Rishut Rabim, says the Mishnah, even if it's 100 amot deep, it's fine. Says, remember, 1 second. Where exactly are you planning on being kovei your shvita? In what spot? Then it's kavein l'shvot hecha. Where exactly do you want your shvita, your Shabbat spot or Yom Tov to be? Ilamala, if you want it to be above, meaning at the top of the pit, then that doesn't make any sense. Then it's not kosher because then hu b'makom echad ve'ruv b'makom acher, right? Then it shouldn't work because you're in a total separate space from your Eruv. You're in a Rishut Rabim. And remember that anything below 10 tefachim is considered to be a Rishut HaYachid, right? Just like above 10 tefachim. It goes up and down. So if you're in the Rishut Rabim and your Eruv is in this space, your Eruv is going to be in a Rishut HaYachid. Ilamata, now maybe you decided, I want to spend Shabbos at the bottom of the pit, right? Hopefully it's a big pit. And so therefore, Pshita, then it'll be obvious. Huve Eruv Makom Echad. Then you're sitting there right next to your Eruv. So why is that a problem? Lo tzricha, it's talking about the koi b'karmelit. In the middle case, this pit is not in a Rishut Rabim, it's not in a Rishut HaYachid, it's in a karmelit, for example, an open field, right? Which is not mukaf l'dira, it's not encased for living, so it's not a Rishut HaYachid. Remember, it has nothing to do with whether you own it or not, right? You own this field, or you don't own the field, it doesn't matter. But it's not an inhabited space, so it's not a Rishut HaYachid. It's not traveled by many people, so it's not a public place. It's not a Rishut Rabim. And there's a big pit. So it's a Carmelit, and you want to stay on the top. This Kavim, the Shvot Lamala, right? But this is now on the bottom of the pit, which is a Rishut HaYachid. Remember, you're not allowed to carry from Rishut HaYachid into a Carmelit, but that's only a Shvut. That's only a Midrabanan. The Rebbe, he, Damar, Kol Davar, Shumishum Shvut, L'Gazr Lev Ben Hashmashot. And it's relying on Rebbe, as we've relied on many, many times, who said that everything that's only Isur Midrabanan is not a problem during Bein Hashmashot. And therefore, you're allowed to do it on for your Eruv. Period. Okay, continues the Mishnah. I think we can do this next
why would you even need an Eruv if it's Rishut HaYachid on your property?
No, so again, I just want to clarify, this is a very confusing thing. So ask it as many times as you can. But the issue with this Eruv is you want to travel, right? You're not allowed to travel beyond a certain space. Right. So you cannot.
This would at least push it a little bit further.
Yeah, right? Or 2,000 amot further, right? Let's say your lunch menu, your lunch invite is 3,000 amot away. You can't get there, right?
No, but if it's on the first case where it's Rishut HaYachid, it's on your, where you live or something.
Yeah.
They say Pshita, but why would you even need to do an Eruv there? Maybe
so
just
we're going to get into this issue a little later about where your shut ends for Eruv. And just because you own a field doesn't mean that you can travel there on Shabbos.
Right. Okay. All right.
But just I want to also clarify: Rishut HaYachid doesn't mean your Rishut HaYachid necessarily. It could be someone else's Rishut HaYachid, right? And we confuse this. This is a very confusing thing because we all ownership with Rishut, and that's not the concept really at all. It could be your friend's Rishut HaYachid. The question is it Rishut HaYachid or Rishut Rabim? So it could be you live, somewhere, you're borrowing your friend's lawn 2,000 amot away. So that's very possible. Okay, continues the mission. Natnu b'rosh hakaneh, let's say you put your Eruv on top of a reed, okay? O b'rosh hakundras. Does someone have a translation for kundras? I don't know what it is. Rashi says pluvlas. Anyways, it's some kind of organic material. It's not attached to the ground. So a bamboo, let's say bamboo. It sounds good. even though I don't think that's what it is. Okay, so you put your Eruv on top of this stand, basically. Bisman shehu talush v'na'utz, as long as it's disconnected from the ground and dug in, meaning it's not growing, then afilu gvoa mea am harezu Eruv. Then it's a kosher Eruv, even if it's 100 amot off the ground. Ask the Gemara, Ramile Rav Ada bar Matan Rava, our Mishnah says talush v'na'utz in, implying, as we all understood, that lo talush v'na'utz lo. If this reed was growing from the ground, or whatever the kundrus is, whatever organic thing it is, then it would not be kosher for the Eruv. Why? Because it's attached to the ground. Now, why is that a problem? Mani Rabbanani. It must be the Rabbanan. The Amri kol davar shu mishum shvut, gazu be ben hashmashot. Right? Because if it was Rebbe, if you recall, what's the problem with something that's growing in the ground? There's an Isser that you're not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos. Right? So that's an Isser midrabanan. And as Rebbe said earlier, Isurim midrabanan do not prevent you from making something using for your Eruv. So therefore, this must be the Chachamim, which is problematic because the last Mishnah, remember we had a whole discussion, we said Amr Reisha Rebbe. So how does that make any sense? Reisha Rebbe versus Sefer Rabbanan? So is that a question mark? Amr Le, yeah. Rami Bar Chama Rav Chisda. We already discussed this question. Rami Bar Chama asked this question to Rav Chisda, and he answered him that in fact that's the case. Reisha Rebbe, the first Mishnah was Rebbe, and it would be okay. And Sefer Rabbanan, this meaning the Sefer, which is our Mishnah, and it could be they had the Mishnahs delineated a little bit differently, right? But the Sefer is the Rabbanan. Ravina says, no, that's not very plausible. Kula Rebbe. And Sefer Gzera Shema Yiktom. Here we have another problem. It's true that in general, Rebbe says that something that's Asr Mishum Shvut, meaning an Isser Midrabanan, as Rashi points out here, sometimes, at least we say every Isser Drabanan is called Shvut, even though it means different things. Rebbe usually says it's okay. But by reeds, Rebbe is particularly concerned that you might cut it down. Why? Because it's easy to cut down, right? So unlike a tree, which takes a tremendous amount of effort to cut down, a reed, and again, I don't know if no one found a translation for me yet of a kundrus, but whatever the kundrus is, presumably it's something that's easy like a reed to cut down. And therefore, we're worried that you're going to want your food and you're just going to cut it down to get the food. And therefore, they made a specific gezerah that you can't put an Eruv on a kundrus or on a reed because you might come to cut it down on Shabbos. Remember that cutting on Shabbos is an Isser Doraita, a Ketzirah, right? So an Isser Doraita you can't do, of course. A Drabanan, a Shvut, of using a tree, Rebbe would allow you to do in order to have Shabbos. Jeff, you have an answer? You're muted. So.
It seems like it's a pole that's at least a foot by a foot. So meaning 4 tefachim, which is a foot by a foot, is pretty significant. It's not so easy to knock over as opposed to the Gemara's easy thing to knock over is a reed.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. I still don't know exactly what it is. Continues the Gemara. We have a few more lines in 1 more minute, 2 more minutes. If you recall, we've dealt with this problem many times. They used to have military troops that would come through town. And of course, they would come and they would take all the food, as we all know, and all the space in every available hotel room. And so once in Naharda, they had a pulmus, and they couldn't rebook them as it was, right? They're a military parade. And so they had no space. They were worried about where they're going to daven and learn the next day. So Amar Lahu Rav Nachman told his students, Puku avidu kavushi kavshi ba'agma. Go and prepare, kavushi means, to push things down, to pressure things down. Go to the swamp, push over all the reeds so that it's easy, so that they're, bent over, and we'll sit there tomorrow and we'll daven and we'll learn there. So we got to go make a new field, basically. So push over the reeds in the swamp. And tomorrow we'll go and we'll sit there and we'll have a impromptu Beit Midrash. Asked Rami Bar Chama Rav Nachman, Rami Bar Chama Rav Nachman, Rami Rav Ukva Bar Abba Rav Nachman. One of the students asked Rav Nachman, I don't get it. If you read our Mishnah says, Talush Na'utz in, Lo Talush Na'utz Lo. That the only time you can use this reed for an Eruv on Shabbos is if it's disconnected. But if it's connected, you're not allowed to because we're worried that you're going to knock it down like any tree. So how could you sit on the reeds? Aren't you worried you're going to cut them down? Amalei hatam uzradim. No, our Mishnah was referring to not regular reeds that are soft. It was referring to specifically thick reeds, which are not too thick, but thicker than regular reeds. And therefore, it's similar to a tree. But in regular plain reeds that you could just bend over, there's no gezerah there. you can go on Shabbos, you can knock over the reeds, you can bend over the reeds. Well, you did it before Shabbos, but you can bend over the reeds and you can sit on them on Shabbos. There's no Gezerah. And how do I know that? How do I know there's a difference between hard reeds and thin reeds and soft reeds? The Tanya, because there's a Braita, Tosefta, which says the following. Hakanin, keep that word, right? Kanin, which means reeds. Vatadin v'haigin, I don't know what those are, but there must be other kinds of reed-like things. Min ilanheim, they're actually a type of tree. And therefore, inan klayim b'karen. The principle in the Tosefta there in Klayim is that you can't climb as with Yerakot in that case. If you have vegetables, it's a problem. But if you have a tree, right, then it's not considered to be a climb. So says the Tosefta, reeds are considered trees, and they're not climb. But there's another Braita which says, Tani Ida, Hakanim v'akidan v'urbanim min yarakim. Another Braita which specifically says the opposite, that reeds are a type of vegetable. They ain't climb b'karen. So Kashya Hadadi, so you have two Braita which one says a kana is a tree and one says it's a vegetable. Elishmami, no, there's different kinds of reeds. There must be. Kamba uzradin, kamba shein uzradin. There are hard, firmer reeds, which we all know. They stay in the ground longer, they become harder, they become more like a tree, and therefore you have to treat them like a tree. And you can't use it on Shabbos, and you can plant it for Kalayim. But the other ones are the soft reeds, which you can use on Shabbos, and you can't plant for Kalayim because they're considered a Yarek. So that's the difference, and that's the same difference that they had in Naharda. Shmamina. Ask the Gemara just one more question. You said in the second Braita that Kida, Rashi's Kida is like some kind of spice that they used. As Rashi says, Bosem Sheshmo Kida. So not that helpful, right? It's like art school gives you, right? Kida, transliterates it. So anyway, some spice, I don't know what it is. So I'm sure Steinsaltz has something. The Kida, as for Kida min Yerek, is it true that Kida is Yerek? But now we have a Mishnah in Klayim that says, Ein markivim pegem agabe Kida levana. You can't graft a pegem, which is another kind of spice, with a Kida levana, right? Which would imply that it's because that's like grafting a vegetable with a tree. So it's calling Kida levana as a tree. Yeah, we got to read the Mishnah. The Mishnah says Kida levana. So Kida levana lechod. There's different things. There's regular Kida and there's Kida levana. Kida levana, again, I don't know what any of these things are. The Kida levana is a spice that is a tree-like spice, and therefore, like cinnamon, I guess, right? And therefore it's, well, that's a good example. Some spice that's hard, right? And therefore it's considered grafting. And Kida itself is considered to be a Yerek, and it's not considered to be grafting. And we made it to the Mishnah, and God willing, tomorrow morning at 7:30, we will pick it up. And Shavua Tov, everyone. And if I don't see you, Shana Tova. Right?
Shavua Tov.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Shabbat.